People picture medieval war as total chaos. No rules, just brute force. But in medieval Europe, fighting was often shaped by real rules and customs. Some were set by the church, some by kings and commanders, and some by the unwritten law of arms that knights and armies expected others to follow. These rules could decide when battles were allowed, which weapons were considered unacceptable, how prisoners were treated, and even how a town was expected to surrender during a siege. Here are 12 medieval war rules that sound completely fake today, but were genuinely real in the Middle Ages. Number 1. No fight days. One of the strangest real rules of war in medieval Europe didn't come from kings at all. It came from the church trying to put the brakes on constant local violence. Starting around the late 900s and early 1000s in parts of what's now France, church leaders pushed movements later known as the Peace of God and the Truce of God. The Peace of God side was basically, leave certain people alone, meaning clergy, monks, pilgrims, and often the poor and peasants who weren't armed fighters. The Truce of God side was, there are times you simply don't fight, and it could get very specific. Sundays, major religious holidays, and in some places even big chunks of the week. In a few regions, the idea expanded into something like, no fighting from Wednesday evening or Thursday through Monday morning, which sounds completely made up until you realize how serious church penalties could be in that world. Breaking the truce could mean public shame, fines, and in the harshest form, being cut off from the church through excommunication, which was a huge social weapon in medieval life. Was it perfectly enforced? Not even close. But it mattered because it created a real expectation that war had off-limits periods, and it gave communities a moral and political argument when they tried to stop raids and feuds. And once you accept that medieval warfare could be shaped by rules like a calendar ban, it's easier to understand how other rules, some even weirder, ended up becoming normal. Number 2, the crossbow was banned. Medieval people didn't ban many weapons outright, but the crossbow got unusually close. In 1139, a major church council, the Second Lateran Council, issued a famous statement condemning the use of the crossbow and the arbalest in conflicts between Christians. The reasoning wasn't that it was magic, or unfair in a modern gamer sense. It was more about what the weapon did to the social order of war. A trained knight with expensive armor, a warhorse, and years of practice was a walking investment, and the crossbow let a much less elite soldier put serious force into a bolt with less training compared to long-term archery practice. People at the time often described it as too deadly, too sudden, and too easy to use against armored men, which made it feel like a threat to the whole knight-centered idea of honorable combat. Here's the twist. The ban didn't erase crossbows. They stayed in use all over Europe, especially with city troops and hired specialists, and they became standard in sieges because they were accurate, powerful, and practical from walls and behind cover. So the rule was real, and the attitude behind it was real, but it collided with military reality. That's a pattern you see again and again in war in the Middle Ages. Leaders announce rules that aim at controlling behavior, then soldiers and commanders quietly keep what works. And once weapons get political, the next rule makes perfect sense. If you can't control what people carry, you try to control what happens after they're captured. Number 3, captured on credit. In modern wars, the idea of letting an enemy prisoner go home because he promised to pay later sounds like a joke. In medieval Europe, for nobles and knights, it could be standard business. The system was ransom, and it worked because social status came with expectations. A captured knight or noble might give his parole, meaning his word of honor, that he would not escape or fight again until he paid an agreed sum. Sometimes a prisoner was allowed to travel to raise money, especially if he had land, family connections, or a lord who could help. This wasn't charity. It was a calculated bet that a noble's reputation was valuable enough to secure payment. If he broke parole, he wasn't just a guy who ran. He could be branded as dishonorable, and that could follow him everywhere. Other lords might refuse to trust him, negotiate with him, or treat him as someone outside the normal customs of war. One of the most famous examples of how deep this culture ran is King John II of France in the 1300s, who was captured by the English and later returned to captivity when a hostage arrangement went wrong, because the entire system depended on maintaining the credibility of noble promises. That kind of thing sounds unbelievable now, but in a world where legal systems were slow, borders were messy, and personal reputation mattered a lot, parole was a working enforcement tool. And once ransom becomes a normal expectation, you start seeing another rule that feels cold but very real. Prisoners weren't just prisoners, they were assets with a value tag. Number 4. Prisoners had price tags. Medieval battles weren't only about territory and politics, they were also about money. And the ransom economy shaped behavior in ways that can feel almost modern. A noble captive could be worth a fortune, while an ordinary foot soldier often wasn't worth the cost of feeding and guarding. That reality created an informal but widely recognized rule. High-status captives were meant to be kept alive and controlled because they were profitable. Over time, this turned into a kind of working system with its own logic. Captors could argue over who owned a prisoner, especially if several men helped bring him down, and commanders sometimes demanded a share or claimed rights over especially valuable captives. There were agreements about dividing loot and prisoners, and written records of ransoms show how contractual it could get. Names, sums, deadlines, and guarantees. Even a knight's equipment mattered. Armor, weapons, and especially horses were valuable, and taking a warhorse could be a major prize. This changes how you read medieval warfare. When you hear that armies hesitated to kill certain opponents, it wasn't always mercy, it was finance mixed with social custom. That said, the system didn't make war gentle. It made parts of war predictable for certain classes of people, mainly those considered worth something in the eyes of the armies involved. And because ransoms required communication, negotiation, and recognition of identity, it leads directly into another rule that sounds like a modern diplomatic concept. There were people on medieval battlefields who were treated as untouchable messengers. Number 5. Heralds were untouchable. Medieval armies needed ways to communicate without instantly turning every contact into a fight, and that's where heralds and envoys come in. Heralds weren't just decorative guys in colorful clothing. They were walking identification systems, expert in coats of arms, family symbols, and who was who on a chaotic battlefield. They carried challenges, arranged meetings, delivered demands, and sometimes helped identify the dead or captured nobles. Because their job required crossing lines, the custom developed that heralds and certain messengers were not supposed to be harmed. Think of it as a medieval version of "don't shoot the messenger," except taken seriously enough to be part of the broader law of arms culture that knights and commanders claimed to respect. It wasn't perfect, and there were ugly exceptions, but the norm mattered. If you treated enemy heralds as fair game, you were basically announcing that no negotiation was safe, and that could come back on you fast. This rule also helped stabilize ransoms, truces, and surrenders, because someone had to be able to carry terms back and forth. So yes, medieval war had moments where an enemy official could ride up, speak to your side, and ride away, because both armies accepted that some contact had to happen. And once you have messengers protected by custom, the next step is paperwork. Actual documents meant to protect people moving through hostile territory. Number 6. Paper armor. Medieval Europe wasn't a world of constant total war. Even enemies traded, negotiated, swapped prisoners, paid ransoms, and moved envoys around. For that to work, rulers used safe conduct letters, written permissions that granted a person the right to travel without being attacked or arrested, at least in theory. A safe conduct could be issued to an ambassador coming to negotiate, a merchant bringing supplies, a messenger delivering terms, or someone involved in ransom payments. These documents often spelled out names, sometimes titles, and the time window they were valid. They could also include who was traveling with a person and what routes or towns were covered. The rule here is what it implied. If a safe conduct was granted, breaking it wasn't treated like ordinary violence. It was treated as betrayal, the kind of act that could trigger retaliation or damage a ruler's credibility in future negotiations. In a period where reputation and trust were political capital, being known as someone whose safe conduct meant nothing could hurt you in very practical ways. So safe conducts were a real tool of medieval statecraft and military life. They didn't guarantee safety in every situation. Bandits and undisciplined troops existed, but they created a recognized standard that even enemies could appeal to. And if you're wondering where this gets really intense, look at siege warfare, where rules could decide whether a town got decent terms or faced the harshest treatment an army believed it was entitled to. Number 7. The siege. First offer. Battles get the attention, but medieval warfare was often about sieges, and sieges came with expectations that feel like a grim form of procedure. A common pattern in late medieval practice was the formal summons. An attacker would demand surrender, sometimes more than once, and the defenders might ask for time, negotiate conditions, or refuse. This wasn't just theater. In the mindset of the time, the choice to resist could affect what happened if the walls were later breached by assault. Many commanders and soldiers believed there was a difference between a negotiated surrender and a town taken by storm. If defenders surrendered under agreed terms, they might be allowed to leave, keep some property, or avoid punishment. If they refused and the attackers forced entry, the attackers often claimed they had broader rights to plunder and impose harsh penalties, arguing the defenders had chosen that outcome by rejecting reasonable terms. It sounds fake because it treats war like a legal flowchart, but it was a real belief reflected in negotiations, in chronicles, and in the way armies pressured towns. Give in now and you get mercy. Hold out and you lose control of the outcome. This is one reason medieval garrisons sometimes negotiated hard for honor-saving conditions, like leaving with weapons or flags, because the terms were part of how they protected themselves and their communities. And because armies knew discipline could break down fast in a successful assault, some rulers tried to control their own troops with another set of rules that surprises people. Written military ordinances that banned certain behavior, including looting specific places. Number 8. Loot rules were written down. It's easy to imagine medieval armies as pure chaos, but by the late Middle Ages, many commanders issued explicit rules, ordinances, or articles of war to control discipline. These could cover things like staying with your unit, obeying orders, not fighting fellow soldiers, and not stealing from allies or neutral communities. A big one that shows up repeatedly is protection of churches and clergy. Even when war was brutal, many rulers understood that attacking sacred spaces could backfire politically and spiritually, and it could also destroy the message that their war was legitimate. So you see rules against robbing churches, harming priests, or violating sanctuary areas, at least on paper. You also see rules about payment and supply, like requiring soldiers to pay for food instead of just taking it, because uncontrolled foraging could turn the countryside into a permanent enemy and collapse logistics. Of course, reality didn't always match the rules. Armies still looted, and commanders didn't always have full control, especially with mercenaries. But the existence of written codes matters because it shows medieval warfare wasn't only might makes right. It also had administrative and legal layers. A king could punish his own men for acts that harmed his strategy or reputation, and those punishments could be severe enough to get attention. So when people say, there were no rules back then, that's just not true. There were rules, and they were often aimed at the same goal modern armies talk about, keeping order and preventing actions that create bigger problems. And that connects to another rule that feels strange now. In some places, ordinary people were legally expected to own weapons and armor, not as a hobby, but as part of national defense. Number 9. Mandatory weapons. In several medieval kingdoms, especially as governments got more organized, there were laws that required free men to keep weapons based on their wealth. This wasn't about knights in shining armor. It was about a broader pool of men who could be called for local defense, garrison duty, or militia service when needed. In England, for example, the Assize of Arms in 1181 and later measures built a framework where different social levels were expected to have certain gear. Maybe a helmet and a spear for one man, better armor for someone wealthier. Officials could conduct musters and inspections, checking that communities could actually produce armed men when the crown called. It sounds fake because it's the opposite of what people imagine. Not, we ban weapons, but the law expects you to own them. The logic was simple. Kings needed manpower, local lords needed people to guard roads and towns, and medieval states didn't have huge standing armies. They had networks of obligation. These laws also fed into how medieval armies formed. Not everyone was a professional soldier, but many were legally tied to the idea that in wartime, you had a role. And once you're building armies out of obligations, you get one of the most important and underappreciated medieval war rules. Service wasn't unlimited. In many places, feudal military duty came with a time limit, which shaped when and how wars were fought. Number 10, the 40-day limit. One of the most practical rules of medieval warfare is that feudal service often had an expiration date. In parts of medieval Western Europe, England is a clear example. Knights who owed military service to a lord were commonly expected to serve for a set period, often described as 40 days per year for overseas campaigning or certain kinds of service. The details could vary, and real life could get messy, but the basic idea mattered. A king couldn't always keep a feudal host in the field for as long as he wanted without paying wages or negotiating extensions. That's a huge deal, because it helps explain why so many campaigns were seasonal, why some kings preferred quick raids, and why long sieges created financial pressure. If you need to keep men-at-arms beyond the obligated term, you're moving toward paid contracts, hired troops, and what we'd recognize as a more professional force. This is also where money substitutes came in, like scutage in England, where a knight might pay a fee instead of showing up, letting the king hire soldiers directly. That shift didn't happen overnight, but the time limit mindset was real. Medieval war wasn't only who has the biggest army, it was who can keep an army together long enough, and legal obligations set boundaries. Now, if you're thinking this all sounds surprisingly regulated, there's another rule that pushes it even further. In some regions, even private warfare, feuds, could be treated as legal only if you followed formal steps, including warning your enemy first. Number 11, the feud notice. Medieval Europe wasn't just kingdoms fighting kingdoms. A lot of violence came from private feuds between families, lords, and city factions. In parts of the Holy Roman Empire and neighboring regions, feuding developed rules that sound almost bureaucratic. A lawful feud could require a formal declaration or notice, basically a letter announcing hostility, before attacks were considered legitimate in the eyes of local custom. The point wasn't to make feuds nice, it was to separate authorized private war from simple robbery and random assault. If you attacked without the proper notice, you risked being treated as a criminal, rather than a warrior with recognized claims. Over time, rulers and imperial authorities also issued Landfrieden, peace decrees that tried to limit feuding or regulate it, setting boundaries on who could be targeted and when. Again, enforcement varied, but the rule mattered because people argued about it, and authorities used it to punish enemies as outlaws rather than honorable opponents. This is one of those medieval things that feels fake because it mixes violence with procedure, but it fits the medieval mindset. Status, legitimacy, and public reputation shaped how conflict was judged. And that leads straight into the final rule, which is probably the most important, if you want to understand why medieval war could have customs at all. Protections like ransom and parole often depended on being seen as a real soldier, not just an armed man. Number 12, no banner, no protection. Medieval warfare made a strong distinction between recognized fighters and people seen as criminals. That line could be blurry, but it mattered. If you fought as part of a known lord's force, under a banner, wearing a badge or livery in a unit that could be identified, you were more likely to be treated according to the customs of war, captured for ransom, negotiated with, exchanged, or at least handled as a political piece. If you were a wandering armed band with no clear master, or someone accused of fighting outside accepted authority, you could be labeled a brigand, a robber, or an outlaw. And once you fell into that category, the nice parts of medieval war customs could disappear fast. This is one reason late medieval armies put so much emphasis on visible identity. Coats of arms, banners, badges, and organized retinues weren't just for style, they were signals. We're part of a legitimate force, and we expect to be treated that way. It's also why commanders sometimes tried to control who could bear certain symbols, because symbols carried legal meaning. In the chaotic world of raids, skirmishes, and sieges, being able to prove who you served wasn't a small detail. It could decide whether you were treated as a prisoner of war or as a criminal caught with weapons. That rule sounds fake because it's basically uniforms decide your rights, centuries before modern international law. But the logic is real. Medieval war was full of violence, yet it also ran on recognition, reputation, and the idea that some kinds of fighting were war and other kinds were just crime.